The title of the sermon is That the Children of Our Children's Children May Live, Reflections on the Crisis at the Border. When the world breaks our hearts, sometimes it is only poetry that helps us make sense. And so each of the 4 parts of this sermon begins with poetry as ground for hope and for action. I begin with Vahafta by Aurora Levins Morales. Say these words when you lie down and when you rise up, when you go out and when you return, in times of mourning and in times of joy. Inscribe them on your doorposts, embroider them on your garments, tattoo them on your shoulders. Teach them to your children, your neighbors, your enemies. Recite them in your sleep. Here, in the cruel shadow of empire, another world is possible. Thus spoke the prophet Roque Douton. Altogether, they have more death than we, but altogether, we have more life than they. There is more bloody death in their hands than we could ever wield, unless we were to lay down our souls and become them, and then we would lose everything. So instead, imagine winning. This is your sacred task. This is your power. Imagine every detail of winning, the exact smell of summer streets in which no one has been shot. The muscles you have never unclenched from worry, gone soft as newborn skin. The sparkling taste of food when no one on earth is hungry, that the beggars are fed, the old man under the bridge and the woman wrapping herself in thin sheets in the back of a car, and the children who suck on stones. They nest under a flock of roofs that keep multiplying their shelter. Lean with all of your being towards the day when the poor of the world shake down a rain of good fortune out of the heavy clouds, and justice rolls down like waters. Defend the world in which we win as if it were your child. It is your child. Defend it as if it were your lover. It is your lover. When you inhale and exhale, breathe the possibility of another world into the 37.2 trillion cells of your body until it shines with hope. And then imagine more. Imagine rape is unimaginable. Imagine war is a scarcely credible rumor, that the crimes of our age, the grotesque inhumanities of greed, the sheer and astounding shamelessness of it, the vast fortunes made by stealing lives, the horrible normalcy it came to have, is unimaginable to our heirs, the generations of the free. Don't waver. Don't let despair sink its sharp teeth into the throat with which you sing. Escalate your dreams. Make them burn so fiercely that you can follow them down any dark alleyway of history and not lose your way. Make them burn clear as a starry drinking gourd over the grim fog of exhaustion, and keep on walking. Hold hands, share water, keep imagining, so that we and the children of our children's children may live. Part 1, Borderlands. Ambos Nogales. That's what locals call it, both Nogaleses. declaring one community undivided by a wall, not two different cities. And you can see how one city has not changed and has changed over the past century or so. One city, one community with a wall in the middle of it. A ragtag group of Unitarian Universalist ministers had plans to pay our respects to the memorial to Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, the 16-year-old shot and killed in 2012 by U.S. Border Patrol. He was on the Mexico side, outside their jurisdiction. And this past November, those who killed him were acquitted. So we, the ragtag group, we discovered that the memorial on the U.S. side had been ominously removed. We learned, though, that the one on the Mexico side still exists. It was dusk when we entered the Morley Street entry point, visiting the wall smack dab in the middle of the one city. And I think we must have been quite a sight. There was a Border Patrol truck idling nearby, and the wall, recently covered with just one row of razor wire at the top. The locals talk about how they see the semi-trucks barreling down the highway, bringing new razor wire every week. In fact, the Monday after I was there, so much razor wire was added that now instead of one row, there are 6, all the way down to the ground, all on the U.S. side. While we were there at the wall, some of us were silent, overshadowed by the monstrosity. Some of us named aloud our resistance to the wall. Others across the street prayed. And I found myself saying over and over, I do not consent. I do not consent to this vulgarity. I suppose it is possible not to notice, possible to stop paying attention, possible for the looming vulgar wall to become normalized, to become semi-invisible and a mere inconvenience. Passing through one of those supposedly temporary checkpoints that have been there for a decade now, I was exquisitely aware of my privileges at first, my white skin, my passport, my innate sense of belonging. Even in the very few days we were there, my attention alerted less and less each time we passed through. So yes, it's possible to become inured to the militarization there in the region. But what do we lose when that happens? What do we lose? This group of ministers, we spent time with folks from the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Amado, Arizona. They are so rooted in place, so connected to their sense of mission and to their geography that they have aptly renamed themselves Borderlands Unitarian Universalist. And there we listened to stories of bloody-footed 13-year-olds knocking on doors in hopes of finding help, of choosing not to call Border Patrol when a migrant shows up at your door because, and here I'm quoting, if someone makes it to my door out of that desert, I will not be the reason they will be sent back. I have felt the heavy weight of someone's fate in my hands, and I won't do that. We heard stories of networks of people who are willing to bend and sometimes break laws to ensure safe passage. It very much felt like an underground railroad. There was a story of a man who showed up, met the right people, and ended up in another state, able to meet his newborn daughter for the very first time. There were no dry eyes in the house for that story. There was a reference to the time when people hid Jews during the Nazi reign of terror, and it did not seem off the mark. One of these people who shared these stories was Barb Lemon, a 77-year-old retired nurse who feels that as an elder, giving safe harbor to migrants is the very best way to live out her life. She asked our group that when we return, that we should tell our people how bad it's gotten, how militarized the country has become, how wrong it is, how everyone must do something to stop this evil. That's the word she used, evil. How there is so much suffering, how she is not sure we can stop it, but that we must try. She said these haunting words: I haven't found a body, but I'd rather find one than let it go unfound. Why do I do it? I can't accept that we will go total evil. I know enough good people, and I think we can stop it. And then this heartbreaking observation: the ground keeps shifting, and always for the worse. Part 2, Operation Streamline. In her poem titled Home, the Kenyan-born, London-raised, Los Angeles residing Somali poet Warsan Shire writes, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You have to understand that no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than the journey." We were in Tucson as faith-based witnesses to Operation Streamline at the Federal Special Proceedings Courtroom, where each business day 75 people, detained migrants largely from Central America and Mexico, in the course of 2 hours are processed, charged with and found guilty either of illegal entry or illegal re-entry. 75 people, 72 men and 3 women, all shackled at the feet, the waist, and the wrists, walking that recognizable perp walk. Except what have they perpetrated? Saving themselves, their families, seeking reunion with family up north, they have perpetrated love and longing, livelihood and largesse. They perpetrate acts made criminal not by their nature, but by a domineering government exercising racist immigration laws. The judge in that courtroom asked these questions of each migrant defendant. Are you thinking clearly? Has anyone promised or threatened or forced you to plead guilty? Do you understand the offense with which you are charged and the maximum penalty? Do you understand the consequences of pleading guilty and your trial rights? Are you willing to give up those trial rights and plead guilty? 16 for whom this was their first entry into the U.S. were given time served and then deported immediately. For those whom it was the case of re-entry, each received a sentence between 30 days and 180 days. Collectively, in that 2-hour period, they received 2,640 days of imprisonment for a misdemeanor charge. When was the last time you went to prison for jaywalking? Also a misdemeanor? We were told while we were there that private prisons receive $161 a day for each of these criminals. In that 2 hours, Core Civic, formerly Corrections Corporation of America, reaped $425,000. Just one day, in a single courtroom that operates 5 days a week, and there are other courtrooms along the border. Big business, this criminalization of migrants crossing the border. Big business, completely choreographed theater with no outcome other than a predestined one of crime and punishment. Operation Streamline started under President Bush, increased pace under Obama, and has become a linchpin for the current administration. In Tucson alone, while the average number of people charged in this program had been about 12,400 in the 5 years previous, the pace was picked up, and in 2018, it headed towards 15,000 by the end of the calendar year. And did I mention that the legal representation for these migrants is barely adequate? A 2013 study by the University of Arizona says so. And so did Lois Martin, our host and guide as we provided witness to these horrendous court proceedings. Another fierce elder whom I want to grow up to be. She has attended court proceedings on a regular basis ever since they started a decade ago. She's 84 years old. Part 3, no more deaths. In his poem, Imagine the Bread of Angels, shared here only in part, Martina Spada calls on us to make this the year of liberation. This is the year that shawled refugees deport judges who stare at the floor and their swollen feet as files are stamped with their destination. This is the year that those who swim in the border's undertow and shiver in boxcars are greeted with trumpets and drums at the first railroad crossing on the other side. If the abolition of slave manacles began with the vision of hands without manacles, then this is the year. If the shutdown of extermination camps began as imagination of a land without barbed wire or crematorium, then this is the year. So may every humiliated mouth, teeth like desecrated headstones, fill with the angels of bread. No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, is a humanitarian aid organization that began in 2004 as a coalition of community and faith groups dedicated to stopping the deaths of migrants in the desert and advocating for humane policies related to immigration reform. Since 2008, it has been an unofficial ministry of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. It does far more than advocate or educate. When they receive word of someone lost in the desert, they lead search parties. When a family knows that a loved one has died in the desert, if they ask, then they run recovery efforts. They place water and socks and medical supplies in the harshest regions of the desert. This won't surprise you, but Border Patrol is hostile towards No More Deaths placing water and medical supplies in the desert. They say it encourages migration. No More Deaths knows that people will cross the desert no matter what. They place water there so that they don't die in the process. No More Deaths collects and publishes data shining a light on the cruelty of this militarized system, like a map of the Aravaca corridor, notating so many deaths, too many deaths. This too does not make them friends among the authorities. Not only are migrants crossing the desert being criminalized in ever more punitive ways, so are the people who are trying to help them. Just over a year ago, in January 2018, 9 volunteers with No More Deaths were charged with federal misdemeanors for abandonment of property, basically for littering in the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge. And in January 2019, Natalie Hoffman, Una Holcomb, Madeline Hoos, and Zacila Orzorko were put on trial and convicted just a few days before my visit. In March, they were sentenced to 15 months probation and fines. Littering by leaving jugs of life-giving water. A brief transcription of the trial has the assistant U.S. attorney asking why they wrote "Buena suerte" on the gallons of water. "Good luck with what?" he asked condescendingly. Well, I think probably condescendingly. The defendant, Una Holcomb, in this case, replied, "Good luck with surviving." Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and who used to serve a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Arizona, made this statement at the time of the court proceedings for these humanitarian aid workers. "I am deeply troubled by this verdict, and my heart goes out to all who are impacted by the decision. Criminalizing humanitarian aid sets a dangerous precedent, both to those who struggle for survival as well as for those who seek to faithfully save lives. I echo the words of No More Deaths volunteer Catherine Gaffney when she asks, if giving water to someone dying of thirst is illegal, what humanity is left in the law of this country? Mid-February, a different 4 of those 9, not the 4 already convicted, their charges were dismissed. And a spokesperson for No More Deaths said this, reminding us to keep our focus on those who are the true targets of these policies. Today might be a victory for No More Deaths, but the people continue to die and disappear every day in the desert. Our hearts remain with the families of the disappeared. And as long as border policy funnels migrants into the most remote corridors of the desert, the need for humanitarian response will continue. The 9th of those No More Deaths volunteers, Dr. Scott Daniel Warren, was charged with a felony in addition to his misdemeanor, a felony of harboring and a felony of conspiracy by providing medical care to 2 migrants he encountered while crossing. Based on the timing and the severity of the charges, No More Deaths believes that it was in retribution for a report they had published just hours before Dr. Warren's arrest, showing that the Border Patrol, in a very damning light, evidence that over a 4-year period, they had destroyed nearly 4,000 gallons of water that had been left out to keep migrants from dying of thirst. As I record this video, Dr. Warren's trial is in progress. Indeed, what humanity is left in the law of this country? Part 4, in summation. Ultimately, the border is arbitrary. It has not been in existence for all that long, about 165 years, particularly when you consider that human beings have been moving across the continent, moving north and south for millennia. It is so clear to me that governments, and in modern times, corporations, make deals, but that people live our lives, making our way as best we can, trying to save the lives of those we love and ourselves, border or not. If I were facing any of what these people were facing, I think I would make the same choices, good, bad, or ugly. I held this intellectual opinion before my recent trip to the border, but now it is a deep, visceral conviction after I learned what I learned, after I saw what I saw. There are media outlets willing to look beyond the newly branded criminality of border crossing, and from them we hear about stories of gang activity in Central America, spurring people to leave their homes in order to find safety in this country, freedom from their sons being dragged into drug culture, their daughters from being sexually assaulted, not to mention that if you are queer or trans, there's no protection for you. And so they come north. But that is not the whole story. That doesn't go back far enough. We have to look in history, and we don't even have to look all that far. We can look to the 1990s and to NAFTA, which destabilized the campesinos, the farmers, and flooded Mexican markets, undercutting the ability to make a livelihood, causing both urban migration and economic insecurity. This so-called crisis at the border, this problem down south, it's on us, friends. It is on this government, and not just the current administration, though that one is doing its best to use it to strengthen and lengthen its authoritarian grip. Friends, I say this to myself and I say it to you. It is on our desire for cheap goods and on our consumer culture. It is on us. And we must not look just back to history, but also to the future, to climate changed future, actually to climate changed now. A 2014 report by scientists and agronomists about Guatemala cautioned how susceptible that nation is to the destructive vagaries of climate change. And it's only getting worse. So, as that ragtag group of ministers, as we listen to the polite judge ask those legal questions of each of the defendants, it occurred to some of us that perhaps turnabout would be fair play. Perhaps we should ask the judge or the prosecutor, were they thinking clearly on that day? Perhaps we should ask those at Homeland Security or the Justice Department if they fully understand the consequences of their actions, the consequences for their own soul and for the soul of this nation. What exactly were they promising and threatening for the guilty pleas of those 75, these thousands, these tens of thousands of migrants? If they are going to ask those beloved humans to give up their right to due process, to a fair and free trial, what are they, these people wielding such power, what are they willing to give up? In addition to witnessing Operation Streamline, this ragtag group of Unitarian Universalist ministers, we canvassed a neighborhood in Tucson, inviting residents to place signs on their property to grow community support for the necessity of humanitarian aid work, as well as to influence future sentencing processes around the charges and the convictions. It was a joy every time someone took a sign. In meeting so many powerful, engaged, determined people, I was struck how dire situations raise up heroic actions in us. the ability to sacrifice, to risk, to show up for the vulnerable and mistreated among us. Lois Martin, that 84-year-old I told you about earlier, she showed us an editorial cartoon that had appeared in the local paper. It was by David Fitzsimmons, and it was published soon after the 4 humanitarian aid volunteers were convicted. It has in it a judge pronouncing them guilty, and then the judge names what they are guilty of. 4 charges of premeditated compassion, 4 charges of first-degree humanity, 4 charges of involuntary kindness. I was struck by what it takes of us and in us to do as Jesus directed. When someone is thirsty, give them a drink. While I personally am not very much interested in a Christian nation, I am very much interested in a humanitarian nation that follows such a compassionate and fierce and obvious directive. So I say, long live this modern-day life-saving Underground Railroad. Long live this network of healers and heroes who know beyond all knowing that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Long live these searchers and responders who declare that this is the year of no more manacles and no more barbed wire. Long live these fierce water leavers who affirm that another world is possible, loving that world as if it is their child, as if it is our child, so that our children and our children of our children's children may live. Amen, and blessed be.